Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Quick word as we lead into our 204th episode. Next week is going to be our final episode before I stop for the summer. We're going to talk about engagement. But I just wanted to make you aware that in response to popular demand, we are going to run a programme, an open management training programme in September. We're just getting people to register interest at the moment, so you can go to the Actus website. I've been running training. We ran a lot of open courses, virtual courses over COVID, and we did lots of it. And then actually, I think people obviously wanted to do more face-to-face, so we've stopped doing them. We've just been doing in-house training. I'm still available for in-house training and consultancy, but we're going to do a Managing for Engagement training course. It will be 4 modules. You can find more about it on the Actus website. So if you've got somebody in your organisation or 2 or 3 people who've been thinking actually they could do with some shot in the arm in terms of their management skills, this could be a solution that would suit them. So if that's relevant to you, please do visit the Actus website and find out more. Now on to our episode where we're going to talk to Teresa Rose all about learning pathways. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I'm delighted to welcome Teresa Rose. She's an award-winning learning and performance consultant and the founder of Consult Her Ltd. She's also someone who holds a master's in HR and a postgrad in psychology, organisational development and change. So she's a great person for me to turn to because she's also very, very experienced in all areas learning and development, which I'm kind of out of practice at, although that was my background many, many years ago. So Teresa, thank you for joining today.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So what we were talking about earlier, and one of the things I was thinking, I always like to demystify things. And we were saying there's a whole grey area out there where there's lots of jargon to do with learning in particular, which I'm hoping you're going to demystify for me. But the overall theme of this episode is going to be around learning pathways, what they are, what's important, how you do it, the ins and outs, the blockers, those sort of things. And the reason we thought we would talk about learning pathways is because I know that many, many organisations are really working on engagement, on career pathways is something that people feel passionate about. And that's not just in the massive organisations, it's those smaller organisations that I know we've got lots of listeners helping people in small and mid-sized organisations. How can you build a career pathway, a learning pathway, when you don't have a massive budget, right? Because this is all really key to engagement, retention, and morale out there. So that's what we're going to theme, isn't it, Teresa? And I thought I'd throw it open to you a little bit and just get you to explain what we might mean if someone talked about a learning pathway and how it might align with a career pathway or any of these other sort of jargon-esque terms.
Yes. So learning pathways have become more prevalent over the last few years with the advent of learning experience platforms. So learning experience platforms were really about giving employees a much better consumer grade experience. The phrase the Netflix for learning was often used, but which isn't a good one. It's not about sitting there consuming lots of content, which a lot of them have been about. And you were talking about engagement, and that's often the initial engagement stats that people will be looking at is, well, have people gone in and have they used the pathways? But in this instance, what you're also looking at is bringing together like best of breed content from various sources, things that you have internally, things that you might bring in. Freemium could be paid for content that are around a particular topic. and give people different levels of information, and different, like, videos are often a common piece in their articles, and giving them, free access for people to be able to go into and use them as and when they want. The dream, I think the utopia was, oh, it's learning in the flow of work,
Mm.
learning at the point of need. I wouldn't say it's got to that. There's still a lot of work to do in that space, but initially that's the vision for what learning pathways were.
So if I put it in layman's terms, so it's, I want to learn a certain thing. So it might be, I want to get better at my communication skills, or I want to learn how to be a better manager, or I want to learn some job specific skills, or I want to go to the next level in my organization. So I've got a learning purpose or something that I need to get to. And it's about being able to access a whole range of content. I want to use the word curated. That's probably old school, is it? But you're saying that
No, that's still very relevant, and I think there's still a lot of work going on around that in learning and development. It's like content curation. How do you do good content curation? Because it's a skill.
yes,
It's a skill for learning and development to have, alongside a bigger blend, community management and all of those things. So it's thinking more from a programmatic way of thinking. So it's not just purely that content. It's like, well, how do you do peer-to-peer learning? How do you learn from one another in your organization? How are you going to enable that? I think COVID pushed us further down with the growth in digital learning, further down that individualistic learning pathway, and not enough of collaborative learning. And I'm hoping that will start to come back more now. We can go face to face again. So I've seen a growth in people wanting more face to face and a move away from digital.
Yes. So you've got this, I mean, there's so many things we can go into here. I'm going to touch on a couple of things, but perhaps we'll come to later in the episode. We should get interesting things, because there is, as you said, there's a challenge in itself. It's all very well having an amazing learning experience platform or an LMS, but the reality is the majority of them will just have a big library of content that the quality may differ and the relevance may differ, and not everybody gets everything they like from that. Will people even use it? So you've got that kind of angle of it. So there's a challenge there about having the best content or the right content, because that's a huge job, I would have thought, mapping the right content for what people potentially need so that they can select. And then there's the other thing about whether people are motivated to do it as well. So we'll talk about culture a bit later, perhaps. But perhaps before I go down that route, so you were talking there about how it fits. Let's go right to the start. So we're at L&D or HR in an organisation, and we want to build some learning pathways to support people in a career pathway. Let's say we want to retain a certain skill set in the organisation, particularly. We're not a massive organisation, so we almost need to manufacture a career pathway where people can see themselves growing. How would you go about aligning a kind of learning pathways? It's, I suppose, in terms of, because you've got to work out what the knowledge, skills, is it knowledge, is it skills, is it competence, is it capability? How would you start with those aspects?
I suppose the knowledge side is, what is it that people need to know and retain? So there's a difference between knowledge that I need to be able to retain, and also what's things that you could use as job aids, as just in time resources, rather than expecting people to retain lots of information and overwhelming them. So it's really thinking, you talk about content, is I say so many organizations that don't have a content plan or a content strategy, and that's where they get this overwhelm and build up of content that's useless, that's obsolete, or they're spending money on things that aren't being used, or they haven't done that real detailed analysis up front to establish what is it we need, what's going to help solve the problem that we're looking at.
So tell me a bit, a content plan would be, an example, I don't know, a small telecoms company, and you to learn some role specific stuff, slightly technical stuff. Would that have a bit with the content plan?
Yeah, because you would look at, well, what have we got already in the organisation? So you'd start looking firstly, what resources have we got? What dates have they got on them? So it's similar to maybe like managing your HR policies. So you'd have a version control or a date. And I don't really see this a lot with content management in learning and development. It's also thinking around how you might do that around a campaign. as well. So just as you would do with, I do a lot of work with digital marketing. So I'm actually currently doing a digital marketing qualification.
Right.
And I'm one of the founding members of Digital Women. So I've got a marketing background previously to HR as well. And you think about when we're buying things, we don't get vast amounts of content. You might get that drip feed of, well, you've sent an email, then you might go on the website, then you might get a reminder email, and it's very carefully thought about in terms of the user experience. And
Yes.
we don't really do that with learning and development. Even when we bring people into a room, we give them so much information and content. We don't consider how our brains work enough a lot of the time, and we just overwhelm people and expect them to come into a room and or go through a learning pathway, and they've instantly retained it without supporting them with, say, peer-to-peer learning. So that's learning from each other in your organization, without giving hints and tips, without giving them ways to put that into practice. So I think that's a lot of the gaps
So that's almost like
we have.
you kind of old school sheep dip, where you kind of it's one size fits
Yeah,
all, kind of
yeah,
general course
yeah,
that you put everybody through. And we're
yeah,
saying really this is a learning pathway would be more about filtering it down and maybe prioritizing it and putting a hierarchy in terms of the content and the learning, maybe in terms of
yeah,
difficulty or relevance. But I mean, that's a
yeah.
huge amount of work. It's a hell of a lot easier, isn't it, just to run a sheep tip?
It is, and that's why it happens,
Yeah.
because we're pressured for time. But I suppose there's a thing as well around doing, well, what difference is it making? So if you're putting people through and you worked out the overall cost, and if you did like an A/B test, it's like, this is method A that we're going to use, but actually we're going to try this as well, and this did or didn't make a difference, and trying that out. And yeah, you've got all of these business pressures and we've got all of these economic pressures, but maybe doing less.
Less, more focused, less better.
Yeah, less better,
Yeah.
less a lot better. I don't think we need the volume of content, and I don't. So I gather evidence in organisations that I work with, and often that's the thing. Is like the things that always come up is there's too much stuff. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to be learning. Make it easier for me to find things. I end up, spending time looking for stuff, and then I lose the will, and I jump off, and I don't bother, and I go and do something of it, because people are, I find, people say, well, they're not self-motivated, but every time I do the research in organisations, the self-motivation to learn is there. And often when I look at motivating factors, the motivating factors to be good at my job, to serve my customers well, to enhance my career, are far above things like earning more money.
Yes.
And people often say they like to learn for the sake of learning. So that motivation is there. I think we tend to put a lot of barriers in place that then demotivate people. And we talk about L&D as an industry, and for me, an industry sounds like something that's always making something.
Yeah, so rather than actually sort of, so
Yeah,
it's just pushing at people as
yeah,
opposed to responding to need, which is what we'd rather be, I guess. There, I was just
yeah,
what you made me think of there, which made me smile. Is my dad used to say that this is going back pre-internet,
mm,
and I said, oh, what's the capital of whatever, or what's the answer to X, Y, Z? And my dad used to say, well, go and look it up. I speak his moral was, go and look it up, but you'll remember.
yeah,
Why would I want to look it up when you can tell me? And so the expedience and the interaction side of things has made me reflect on learning styles. You and I were both on a podcast recently where we
yeah,
were learning styles that maybe are not everybody buys into, but without a shadow of a doubt, although I really quite like learning, I was learning something this morning for a purpose, because I was writing a webinar and I was
yeah,
like, oh, that's really interesting, and really wanted to get into it. But it was the fact that I needed to learn for a purpose,
yeah,
an imminent purpose, that I then was motivated to do it. I'm not going to be motivated, and personally, sort of e-learning on the whole, that's it's quite a reflective style of learning. That's not necessarily my style of learning, and although it's way better in many ways now, but having to go through something for 40 minutes in a quite a reflective fashion, I wouldn't choose to do that just for the heck of it. I'd rather learn in a different way, which is kind of going off there, but I suppose that's going back to the fact that we need to give people a variety of options for this.
yes,
And this whole thing about, I mean, the panacea is learning, access to learning at the point at which you ask a question. But again, I suppose then that's linking back to, you need to, for you to have a learning experience platform that's got these answers, you type in, how do I do X, Y, Z? You've got to have done the work. That is an industry. You've got to have done the work to identify that people are going to ask that question and have the answer in there, or point people at it in the first place. So it's quite a big ask. And I suppose particularly in a smaller organisation, because if you are a massive international organisation, you probably could identify questions, and it's worth your while because enough people will benefit from that work and that industry. It does feel like an industry to create it.
Yeah.
Do you do that in a smaller organisation when frankly you're not going to have the work, the resource to do it? How would you maybe manually or sort of support that kind of learning?
I think the first port of call is always, what's the internal knowledge? I think we often forget about what we already know and what's available in people's heads, and getting that out, because you'll have lots of resources. Even if you're a small organization, you have policies, you'll have whatever, and then it's like, we'll look at a way to organize that, and that might be something like Microsoft Teams. So if you're a small organization, you're still probably going to be using some digital technologies, so you don't need to go out and buy a platform per se. It's also thinking about, well, what data do you want out of that? So there are lots of ways, because you've got some of these tools. You've got free things like Padlet or whatever that you could organize content into. So there are lots of different free tools, and also your internal tools that you already have, that you could start to do that with. It's then keeping it up to date and keeping it useful and usable. That's some of the recommendations I'd start to make. So what knowledge do we have? How do we capture that knowledge? Where should we hold it? Who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to update it?
And I guess you've also got to prioritize as well. If you're in a small organization, you can't do everything. So
no.
So what's the most important? What's going to, for whatever the purpose or the focus or the needs of the organization are, what's going to be what's the key area that we need to focus in, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also about, sort of fun things as well. I've got a good friend, Karen Bailey. We know we got to meet each other through working in the CIPD, and she works for a smallish organisation, and their most popular content is a guy that goes out with a GoPro on his head and films the truck. There, it's a truck company, so he films how he does the maintenance and what are the different parts, etc. And that by far is the most valuable content they've got in their organisation.
Tell me that they have something to do with trucks.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, so yeah, they do. They do. So they're I won't say who they are.
Okay, for you. They're not a healthcare provider.
Yeah, but that's a simple thing to do, and it's not going out and buying content. But John with his camera on, it's his daily job, and he's going around, and he's quite fun, and he enjoys doing it, and he enjoys sharing his knowledge.
Yeah,
that's a way to get into the knowledge, the tacit knowledge that people have in their heads.
That's like YouTubing how to do something, isn't it?
And which we all do. Yeah.
And it's got that element of real human in as well. So maybe that's quite nice. If you've got a real human with personality, it gives a bit more than something that's dry. Yeah. And informal.
Yes.
So there's something about prioritizing, and we've talked a few things there about the sorts of content people might like, in terms of that, understanding how to measure things. We talked a little bit about this before in terms of trying to, I guess, measure change in terms of skill development, and how tricky that is. What's your take in terms of that, in terms of the opportunity we have to actually, if we did do an intervention, if we did invest in something, how could we actually demonstrate that people have learned something or their skills have improved?
I mean, more broadly on skills, I think the largest challenge is the fact that there are so many different methodologies that have been developed and are still being developed. There are some national frameworks. There are different frameworks that some of the vendors are developing. They all have very different definitions in them. They all have very different proficiency levels or rubrics. So some might have 1 to 4, some might have 1 to 8, some might have 1 to 7. And I think it's about thinking in your organization where you need more objective data and where you can be happy with more subjective information. So where are you making maybe key decisions and you need to get a lot more information, and is a scoring rubric that might be in one system, is that useful enough? Have you got a feedback culture where you can get more data from peers, from managers around someone's ability and skill? And also I think we often forget our external clients or customers. A smaller organization might have Trustpilot that they use or whatever, and they might be getting customer feedback. But how do you go about using that as part of your learning data as well? We often forget about our clients, external clients, and gathering stakeholder input from them.
So I guess so there's two things talked about there. So there's the second one I'm more familiar with, but I can visualize because it feels more like a 360 feedback. So if you so if you've got a 360 feedback tool or something like that, and you've defined what the behaviors or I guess capabilities, as long as they're observable, or competencies, then you can have a score. You can have a set of questions and that relate to them and have scores on them, and someone can self-report, but you can also go out and see how objective that is, or sort of moderate that by getting different groups of people, whether it's external employees, whether it's line manager, whether it's peers or or team members, whatever. So that is a feedback tool. Incidentally, we have one of those that you can put your own notes in. Quick word, Actus 360. But the feedback tool that works. But when you're talking about this term rubrics, forgive my info, are we talking about things like, I don't know, and like the external sort of professions has gone up my head. I mean, is that what we're talking about? Like ILM or that's apprenticeship?
Yeah, it might be even like the languages. You get a languages rubric, so CEFR. I don't know what the acronym means, but it's used in Duolingo, for example. So it's looking at how proficient you are in a language by a description that says, well, if I'm basic, I'm mostly doing this, and it's described. Same with things like an advanced. Yeah, so that would be like your rubric that you would set up.
So it's a scoring rubric. Externally,
it could be one that you create internally, because if it's more meaningful for you, you might have like maybe off the shelf competencies. So, for example, the CIPD. Or it could be another professional body like Institute of Marketing will have different professional levels, or they might have a capability map, and there's content within there that says what you should be working at. And that helps them with things like you were talking about earlier, career paths. So I might be taking the statements from these because I'm in a professional body of some description, and then I would be working towards, and that helps me with my development and my plan and my career pathing, because I might want to get to a certain level in human resources. And a lot of your listeners probably be familiar with CIPD and the different level in there. So that does help give a framework. But if there isn't one that exists, you could look at some of those methodologies and take those principles and apply them to something that makes sense for your organization or particular career path.
Yes, I'm thinking with decisions like project management, aren't there? External project and ILM, I understand that makes sense. And if there isn't, you almost have to try and create something for if it's a specific skill, but it's that objectivity of that skills that you'd be able to look at, and knowledge in that. Okay, great. So that's I think that's useful in terms of understanding what the framework is and some of the messaging on that. We touched on this a moment ago, didn't we, a little bit, in terms of motivation for someone to learn, even though people say they're motivated to learn, but are they motivated to learn, and what maybe helps and hinders in that area? We talked a bit earlier about culture and things. I don't know whether there's what's your view in terms of how we can, because some people might say, actually, I really love learning, but I'm too busy doing the day job. Or is there anything about the culture? How can we actually genuinely create a learning culture? What's your take on that?
I think time always comes out as the barrier, and I wonder how big an excuse that really is. Because like if you really do want to learn something, you will take the time. But it's also the organisation thinking, well, if we want to increase our capability and capacity of our organisation, are we going to make this time for people to practice? So I think the challenge with the reskilling and upskilling is often we're going to be looking at people having to do that really on the job because of labour shortages, talent shortages. And how are you going to give the people both the chance to fail, that learning through failure and not expecting they're going to get it right straight away, but also to practice and to reinforce and to get coached through it in the work. And I very much like the approach. So some work I've done with a previous client is really looking at how I build new ways of, and into general workflow. So looking at people's end-to-end days, where would you insert things in? If you want people to be better at communicating, in how would you make their meetings different? So how could you go in and observe and think, well, actually, I could slot this job aid or this toolkit in here to help them. And then once they've got used to using that, they don't need to refer to it anymore. So it might be how to do something really unusual or different in the meeting that they've not done and make it more collaborative. That's the way I like to look at things, is really be in people's daily reality and work.
And so that is quite different from, I mean,
Yes.
that's almost that's almost what a learning experience pathway or learning experience platform is trying to do, but is, that's a digital approach.
Yeah.
Whereas you can't, I mean, real stuff, real human understanding, that's not easy to replicate by a
No.
robot or AI. So in terms of that sort of thing, so it's almost like a common sense approach, though, just being a little bit creative about putting things into the way of working, getting people to think about, just take a step back from their usual behavior and think, how could we do that? And that's interesting, because I think when I've often thought, when I've talked to people in my background, L&D, and think, managers coaching or getting people to swap or shadow, there's all sorts of things you can do that don't cost anything, but you just got to think a little bit differently, and make it happen. It's just got to be a bit of a will, from an organizational level. The manager's got to let it happen, the other people got to let it. It's got to become a cultural acceptable thing. Yet sometimes there's resistance to it, isn't there? I don't know. Have you got a view on how you can address that, or why there is resistance to it when it seems to be such obvious common sense? Learning languages.
We don't like to be told that we're bad at anything. People often don't like that feedback, or it's how it's framed. So it's looking at, well, how can you frame that in a way of what's in it for them? So often people, all good stakeholders will come to you and say, I've got a problem with that. So, so and so isn't managing their time well. Need to send them on a time management course. And it's something I use the phrase, if you, for certain as you might be aware of the children's program called Mr. Ben.
Yeah.
And I call it like the Mr. Ben syndrome. So Mr. Ben's this normal guy that lives on Acacia Avenue, and he goes to this dress shop and he goes in the room and he puts these clothes on and off he goes and he has an adventure. But he comes back, he takes the clothes off and he goes back up Acacia Avenue and he's Mr. Ben again, and his life's the same. And I often think that's very similar with learning. So we'll go off on these experiences, or we might go through a learning pathway if it's online. But then what actually changes?
Yeah.
It's just so easy to shift back to the way we were doing things. So putting these things like behavioral science and nudge theory, and putting those things in place, even if it's signs in an office or on a wall somewhere, or something that people can use that's reusable in a room, in a meeting room. How to conduct your meeting, and a little video or something that you send them out, something fun online that you
Yeah.
found. There's lots of ways to start to do it and encourage people. That's smaller things. If it's a bigger thing, then it is more coaching. I look at organizational development in like an organizational coach. I
Yeah.
look at it through that lens, and you have to very much think about yourself as the intervention. And there's a lot of work in organizational development about self as instrument. And even if you're not in organizational development, it might be something to start to look at. So how do you, in your conversations with your stakeholders, with the people that you're wanting to change, because that's what learning and development is generally about, is how do you show up? How do you have those conversations? How do you manage more challenging conversations? How do you ask questions and be curious? Because that's one of the best things to do rather than tell. Because if you start to ask questions and reflect things back, and that's why I say then you start to build those relationships and the trust to be able to support and help with that change. That's where I've definitely had the most impact, and doing with rather than to. So where I've worked on co-creation, working with managers, working with employees, because often they'll say what the issues are, and then you say, well, if we work together on this and we look at it together and it's collaborative, then they've got ownership of it as well. So I think they would be some of the key things that I would say to look at doing.
And I mean, and the bottom line is, and because I say I've got listeners here that they don't have an L&D professional in their
Yeah,
organisation, they are the HR, OD, L&D
yeah,
person. It's perhaps it's seeing yourself as that intervention and
yes,
maybe trying to carve
yeah,
out some time for you not doing the operational stuff. I mean, this is where everyone feels busy, doesn't it? And often the operational
yeah.
stuff stops us from doing the stuff that actually can make more difference. But
Mm.
you've got to think longer term and have that space to go and listen and coach and create those opportunities to have a longer term impact, which often I know is easier said than done, but it is that kind of 80-20, isn't it? That's that prioritizing some of that type of investment of time will actually make a huge difference in terms of taking people forwards.
Yes. So I mean, as much as you can do, which doesn't take people away from the work, if it's a something very big that they're going to learn, and that's often like more of a qualification that they might be, that's very different.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at the operational way of the organization and day to day, then there's lots that you can do along those lines that I've mentioned.
Yes, and I think the other thing, if I was in a small organisation, the way I'd look at it is look at the line managers who are that way inclined, because that could be a development for them. If you get
Yeah,
coaching qualification,
yeah,
you teach them how to
yeah,
coach, but give them a specific role which is about developing people. So it's not just sitting with HR; it is something where we're all in it, and you agree ways in which people, cross mentoring and things like that, that it can
yeah.
be disseminated because it can't all sit with one person, can it?
Yeah, and the line managers are so often forgotten, and and all the research shows how pivotal they are in learning transfer. And when I do my research in organizations, often the managers are very good at having conversations about the learning that's needed. But then again, I'm going back to that point of how do you then practice it in the inside the organization and in your work. That's often where the percentages will drop off. And when I have
Yeah.
discussions with people, say, no, my manager's happy to send me on this or
Oh,
this, but then doesn't help me to put it into practice, or doesn't give me the time to put it into
yeah.
practice.
Or doesn't even just coach me, because they don't have to be an expert, just actually know what
Yeah.
have you learned, how can you use it, just some basic coaching questions to get people to think about it.
Mm.
Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of stuff there.
Yes, we have.
We've rushed through quite a few things there. So let's summarize that. We've talked about I guess learning pathways, which isn't as big a jargon as anything else. I suppose it's just like working out
No.
what do you need to do to learn. So how do you learn something? How do you increase your skill or competence or knowledge in a certain area, in line with the purpose that you might need to
Yep.
do with things like that. And we managed to avoid the talent marketplace, like the talent thing. It's linked to talent, isn't it?
Yes.
And so we got that. So we talked about that. We've talked about the role of LXPs, learning experience platforms, or LMS, and the challenge it is. It's not as easy as just having a content there. Is that actually, if you want to help people with that, do you have someone who understands how to diagnose the needs along a certain line? You could potentially, I suppose, if it is, we talked about external value, if it's something like an external rubrics you talk about, which is the structure of something. It's not sort of CIPD because they'd have the same ones, but whether it's it's something which is externally validated. Actually, I think about NHS, they've got loads of pathways, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Yeah.
It makes sense to do that. Then you could go and refer to something like that, which might structure it. And actually, probably quite a lot of the stuff's out there as well. If it is an externally validated, look what's out there. In terms of culture and motivation, well, I think that's a bigger topic. We've kind of gone around the edges, but fundamentally, line managers play a part in it. We play a part in it. Trying to encourage people. It's about listening. It's about diagnosing. It's about helping people to help themselves in terms of that sort of learning pathway. And with that, not letting the busyness necessarily be the excuse that it can be in terms of how do we get that motivation. But again, probably the line manager is going to help us and helping people see a link to where they can go through the organization. So culturally, how can we emphasize that that's the right thing to do? Is there anything you want to add there, Teresa?
Oh, like a top tip or something.
Top tip,
a top tip. I think it goes back to what knowledge have you already got inside your organization, both people, content, and start there. And maybe do some sort of audit of what you have already and how you might organize that better than it already is.
That's a really good one. I remember I worked for Siemens, and I remember they say, if only Siemens knew what Siemens knew.
Yes.
Is that kind of, is there so much?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. Start there.
Yeah. That's your content plan thing. Absolutely. Find out what we've
Yeah.
got, make sure it's relevant, make sure people can access
Yeah.
it. Start simple,
Yeah.
because it may be that you've solved a lot of those problems. It's just that people don't know where to look.
And then look at the design of those things as well, so you can start redesigning them in a much more user-friendly way.
Yeah.
Than less words, more images with text and visuals than lots and lots of text that you provide. Maybe how could you digitize them if they're more analog with tools that you've already got in your organization. So things like Canva, that's like £10 a month to use.
Yeah.
And you could quickly create an infographic of something and take the text from that and make it far more user friendly.
Yes, that's a good tip.
Yeah,
I can use Canva. So if people want to get hold of you, how would they find you?
My company website is a good place, because then it's got links to my Twitter and LinkedIn for my business and for myself. I'm a bit quieter on LinkedIn at the moment because I've got heads down doing a lot of work. But often I'll post information on LinkedIn, and if you go over my previous posts, there's lots of things I'll post that are free there as well. Really useful free resources to use. So that's where you can find me.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining me today on the HR Uprising podcast.
Thank you, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.